Hey, what's up and welcome back. This is Norris again, and today I'm doing a quick tutorial on a men's bowling shirt using McCall's pattern 7206. Let's get started. Okay, so before getting started, you're going to need McCall's pattern 7206. I'm going to be working on view B, but you can do whichever view you want. The sewing is almost all the same. The difference is this has no pockets and it only has 2 panels, unlike view D. And view A is all of the same fabric. Alright, so if you look over to the back, you'll have suggestions for fabric at the top and also suggestions for sizes. I usually check here, but also check the finished garment measurements. This is going to give you a more accurate fit when you sew your garment up. Okay, now I'm going to go through all of the pattern pieces you need to cut out. First, you need to cut out pattern piece number 6, which is the sleeve. You need to cut 2. You need to cut out pattern piece number 1, which is the front, and you need to cut out 4 and 2 out of interfacing. The reason we've cut out 4 of these is because 2 is going to be our front panels and 2 is going to be the facing for those 2 panels. You'll need to cut out pattern piece number 2, which is the middle front, and you have to cut out 2. Pattern piece number 3, which is the side front, and you'll need 2 of these as well. Pattern piece number 5, which is the collar, and you'll need to cut out 2 and 1 of interfacing. Pattern piece number 4, which is the back, and you need to cut out 1, and this is going to be cut out on the fold. And last but not least, we have pattern piece number 7, which is the pocket. I'm personally not going to be using this one, but if you're doing one of the views with the pockets, I'm going to talk you through how to make it and put it on. So before we cut out our fabric, I just want to reiterate that we're going to be cutting out interfacing for pattern piece number 1. We're going to be cutting 2 of interfacing out of this one only for your facings, not for your front pieces. And also pattern piece number 5, which is the collar, we're going to be cutting 1 out of interfacing for one of the collars. Okay, now that we have all of our patterns cut out of fabric, we can get started. But before we continue, I want to point out that I will be doing my facing pieces in the contrasting white fabric. And for my collar pieces, I did both the white and the floor pieces too. Okay, first step, you want to take your front and your middle pieces. The middle piece should be the contrasting one if you're doing the one I'm doing. And you want to place them right sides facing. And then pin at your notches first. Okay, after you pin, you want to stitch all the way down the side using 5/8 of inch seam allowance. Okay, using 5/8 of inch seam allowance, we're going to stitch using a straight stitch all the way down. Back to the beginning end. Alright, back to the end. Okay, you can use a serger to trim off the seams or use a zigzag stitch. Okay, I stitched down the side, I serged off my seams, and I also pressed my seam towards the middle. And if you're following along with the pattern instructions, it's going to tell you to top stitch a quarter away from the seam onto the middle panel. I'm not doing that because I want a clean look, but if you want to do the top stitch, this is the time to do that. And next we're going to attach our side panel. So take your side panel and right sides facing. You want to stitch this down. You want to pin this to the middle panel. Pin at the notches first. Okay, so once you have it pinned, you want to go to the sewing machine and stitch this down using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, just like we did the first one. And once you do that, you want to serge it or either zigzag the seams and press it towards the middle where the middle panel is and come back. Okay, after I gave it a full press and we have one side fully done, you want to take your front pieces connected to your middle piece and then also your side piece and sew them up the exact same way we did this side. And once you do that, we're going to come back and continue. Okay, now that you have both sides done, we're going to put this to the side for just a moment and grab your back. So the shoulder of the back is a little bit wider than the shoulder of the 3 front panels. So we're going to do some ease stitching between the 2 dots that you should have transfer over to your fabric. And we're going to do 2 rows of basting stitches, and then we're going to ease it down to the same width of your front piece. Okay, starting at the notch, we're going to use a basting stitch, and we're going to back stitch at the beginning but not at the end. Okay, once we get to our marking, we're going to stop, lift up the needle, pull the threads, and then cut them. And we're going to do one more row right next to that one, a 1/4 inch away. So once again, back stitch at the beginning but not at the end. Lift your needle, your presser foot, pull your threads, and then cut them. Okay, once you get your 2 rows of basting stitches, you want to take the end that is loose and you just want to pull and then distribute the fabric all the way across. And once you do that, you want to test still with your front panel, and if it's even, you want to pin at the notches and then continue across the shoulder. Okay, once you have one side pinned, you want to distribute the other shoulder and pin the other shoulder with the front piece the same exact way. So we're right sides facing. Now that we have both sides pinned, the shoulder of the front connected to the shoulder of the back, we're going to stitch across both shoulders using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you do that, we're going to come right back and we'll continue. Okay, once you attach your front and back pieces at the shoulders and you serge or either zigzag your seams, give it a good press and press the seams backwards. Then next you want to use a basting stitch to keep the collar in place so it won't stretch when you continue working. So start at one dot and go all the way around to the other dot using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you do that, come back and we'll continue. Okay, once you have the neckline secured with a stay stitch, you want to take this and put it to the side for just a second and then grab your collar pieces. So the collar piece that is interfaced, which is the one I cut out of white fabric, you want to take that one and you want to use a basting stitch in between the 2 dots that you should have transferred on your collar using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and come right back. Okay, once you have the basting stitch in between your 2 markings, you want to take your scissors and you want to slip right at the mark. And after that, you want to trim this down to a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So we have a seam gauge, you can use that just to make sure you cut it out right. Okay, once you give it a good press, you want to place the other collar on top of it, right sides facing, and we're going to pin along the sides and across the top, leaving this bottom piece open. Okay, once you have it all pinned, we're going to stitch along the sides and across the top using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And remember, we're going to leave this side right here open. So we're going to stitch this down using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and we're going to back stitch at the beginning and at the end. some back stitches at the end. Okay, now that we have our collar pieces stitched together, we're going to trim the seam allowance around the side and across the top. I'm going to trim it down to 1/4 inch. And we're going to clip our corners. Trim a little bit more of that corner right there, so it won't be so bulky. And then we're going to turn her right side out. So take it over to the sewing machine and give it a good press. Okay, once you give it a good press and you make sure that 3/8 of an inch is tucked on the inside and pressed as well, and we're going to baste the collar together only right here and right here using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, now that I've basted both of my ends here, you're going to take your main piece and with the right sides facing, we're going to pin it to the collar, matching up our notches and markings. So you should have a marking right here. The end of your collar should be placed right there and pinned. And you're going to do the same thing to the other side. And match up the notches. You want to place that dot here, right there where the seam is, on your shoulder, and pin. Okay, once you have it all pinned, I want you to notice that I kept this part right here free, but all this is pinned together. So you're going to go to the sewing machine and you're going to stitch using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way across, and when you get here you want to leave this middle piece open and stitch the undercollar to the back and go all the way across and finish up on this side. Okay, starting on one side using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, we're going to back stitch at the beginning. Okay, so now we're approaching the part that's been cut out. You want to pull the free part back and continue. Okay, now that we're approaching the other side of the collar, we're going to stitch the rest of it down using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance as well. Alright, back stitch at the end. Okay, once you attach the collar to the shirt, you want to lay it to the side just like this. And take the facing, which is literally the same as your front piece, but it has interfacing on it. And you want to turn 1/4 inch at the top and give it a press. And also along the notch side, as you see right here, you can go ahead and finish it. You can do a zigzag stitch or you can serge it. I prefer to turn it under 1/4 inch and press it. You can finish yours however you want to, but I prefer to turn it in 1/4 inch because I'm going to be slip stitching it to my front piece later. But anyway, you want to pin with right sides facing, and you're going to sandwich your collar piece just like this. And right here where your collar had the cutout, that's where you're going to place the end of your facing, and then you're going to pin it. You should have markings here too, just to let you know. Another marking right here and pin. pin at that notch right here. And then I'm going to continue pinning all the way down. Okay, once you have it all pinned, we're going to stitch using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, starting at the end of the facing. We're going to stop and pivot at the corner and go all the way down. And before we get all the way to the hem, we're going to mark 1.25 inches up. And once we get to that marking, we're going to stop 1.25 inches away from the edge. Okay, starting at one end of the facing, we're going to stitch this down using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Back stitch at the beginning. Okay, once we get 5/8 of an inch away, we want to stop and pivot and continue all the way down. Okay, once we start approaching that little marking that we made, indicating that we're 1.25 inches away from the edge, we're going to pivot. And we're going to continue stitching using 1.25 inch seam allowance. Back stitch at the end. Now that we've attached one of our facings, we're going to do the other facing to the other side the same exact way. Okay, now that we have both facings attached, we're going to do some trimming. So before I start trimming, I'm going to make a split right here. You want to trim it all the way down to the stitching without going through it. And this part right here is going to be folded up into the seam right here, and that's going to be slip stitched. But before we get there, we're going to trim this down all the way down until the end of the hem, and we're going to trim it to the corner. And we're going to trim it down to about 1/4 inch. And then trim it to that corner like I said. Okay, now that we have our 2 slits at the top and we've trimmed along our corner and down the side, we're going to do one more trimming down at the bottom of our hem. So right here at the hem, we're going to cut some of this corner off without cutting into our stitches. And we're just going to take a little bit out, just like that. And we're going to do the other one the same exact way. And now we're going to turn the right side out. Press your corners out. So it can look just like this. And then to the top. And so it can look just like this. So once we press out both corners, we're going to move to the middle of the collar and we're going to press up this remaining seam here. Take it to your iron and press it up, and we're going to enclose it in the collar here, and then we're just going to go ahead and hand stitch this close. So once you hand stitch this down, you're going to fold your facing down just like this, making sure it's not pulling here, and you're going to hand stitch this down as well onto the seam allowance. Once you do that, you're going to continue pressing the rest of your facing. Okay, I went ahead and slip stitched my collar down and also the facing to the shoulder seams. And then I went ahead and stitched in the ditch to stitch down my facing. You can do that, or you can just top stitch it without it being into the seam. But I went ahead and actually stitched in the ditch, which means I stitched the facing down by stitching through the middle of the seam. That's what you call stitching the ditch. Or you can just take your time and hand stitch it all the way down. So moving along, we're going to attach the sleeves. So lay it down flat like this. This method is called the flat method. So before we attach it, I went ahead and did 2 rows of basting stitches, just like we did the back shoulder, and I gathered just enough for it to fit onto the shirt. So a right size facing, we're gonna pin at the notches first. I made a little slip at the top of the sleeve to attach to my shoulder seam. Okay, now that we have our sleeve pinned to the shirt, we're going to stitch, starting from this end all the way to the other end using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, once again we're going to use 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So back stitch at the beginning and end. Alright, back stitch at the end. Okay, you want to do the other sleeve the same exact way. And also you can go ahead and finish off your seam by serging or using a zigzag stitch. Then give it a good press. Okay, once you attach both sleeves, you want to turn your shirt right size facing. And we're going to close out the side seam. First you're going to match up the underarm seam and pin. Pin at your notches. Okay, once you have it all pinned, we're going to do 1 continuing stitch using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, starting from the sleeve all the way up under the armhole and all the way down throughout the hem. You want to pin and sew the other side seam the same exact way and come back so we can continue. Okay, once you stitch down both sides, you have to finish off the inside seam with a zigzag stitch or either a serger. After that, only thing left to do is to do the hem of the sleeve and also the hem of the shirt, which is 1 1/4 inch. And lastly, you want to take your front piece for the placements of the buttons and the buttonholes along the front. I don't do buttonholes on here because every machine is different. So just look up the instruction manual for the buttonholes on your machine for your buttonholes. And once you do all of that, you're all done. Alright, you completed your men's bowling shirt. Thanks for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Please leave me feedback in the comments below. Also in the description box below, I left a link to where you can find the pattern and also links to me rocking the shirt. See you next week.